The acrid smell of stale beer and fear was James Whitman's constant companion. Tonight, it was thicker, more suffocating, laced with the metallic tang of his own blood from a split lip. Not again. The 10-year-old whispered a prayer, lost in the decaying chicken coop he called home. But his plea dissolved as the creaky door didn't just burst inward with its usual lazy kick of dusk, but was ripped from its rusty hinges with the violent slam of dawn. Roy Geller, a beer-bellied storm of fury, eyes bloodshot and wilder than usual, lunged. A glint of steel flashed. "Thought you could hide it, you little rat," he roared, spittle flying, pressing the cold, chipped blade of a hunting knife against James's slender throat. James froze the ice of the steel, a horrifying contrast to the sudden burning need to survive that surged through him. A half-eaten sandwich pilfered from a bin tumbled from his trembling grasp. Roy's fist connected with the wall, inches from James's head, the rotting wood splintering. "This is my house, my food and you." He pressed the knife harder, drawing a pinprick of blood. "Are my property." That child, cowering but not crying, heart hammering against ribs that ached from yesterday's beating, didn't need pity. He needed a miracle. And sometimes miracles arrive in the most unexpected forms. If a place with a roof, however leaky, and walls, however rotten, could be called home, then James Whitman's was this dilapidated chicken coop. It once housed broiler chickens. Now patched with decaying planks, it offered little more than a mockery of shelter. The roof wept with every rain. The floor was an icy condemnation, and the absent windows offered no glimpse of a brighter world, only the perpetual gloom. No power outlets hummed with life, no gentle hand tucked him in. No one called him son. To the indifferent world, it was an abandoned corner behind a neglected backyard. To James, it was the only space he could find a moment's respite from the blows, a sanctuary born of desperation, not love. Dusk had cast long, mournful shadows, and a cold drizzle blurred the warped window frame of the decaying wooden house in the down-at-heel suburbs. Inside the smoke-stained kitchen, heavy with the miasma of stale beer cigarettes and forgotten food, James stood a small, trembling reed beside the table, his tiny hands clutching the hem of his tattered shirt. A sudden, deafening crash ripped through the charged air. The beer mug, heavy and cheap, slipped from James's grasp, exploding on the cracked, tiled floor. Frothy liquid spread in a dirty, accusing streak beneath his bare feet. A feral roar erupted from Roy Geller. "What the hell did you just do? You think this grows on trees, you worthless piece of trash?" The man-tattooed arms, rippling eyes, swimming in alcohol-fueled rage, charged. He seized James by the collar, yanking him up as if he were nothing more than a bundle of rags. "You just let him wreck the place," Roy bellowed at Hilary Vaughn, James's biological mother. She didn't even spare a glance for her son. Slouched on a torn leather armchair, she swirled a liquor bottle with an air of practiced apathy, her voice colder than the encroaching winter wind. "I told you he's not my child." The words, a familiar litany of rejection, slashed through James's fragile soul like a well-honed blade. Yet he didn't cry. He remained silent, his unshed tears sinking inward stones in the pit of his heart. Roy raised a hand, preparing to strike. James, wiry and quick from years of anticipating such moments, dodged. His eyes held no plea, only a quiet, desperate weariness. "Get out! Go sleep under the damn streetlights, you goddamn freeloader!" Roy spat, shoving him towards the door. James stumbled out into the relentless rain, clutching a tattered backpack, his small feet splashing through muddy puddles, the cold seeping into his bones. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to escape. Escape the fists, the venomous words, escape the woman who had once called herself his mother. He found precarious shelter beneath the rotting stairs of an old, crumbling apartment building. It was damp, dark, and reeked of mold and neglect. But here, at least, no one hit him. He placed his bag down and pulled out a damp, treasured book. 100 Rights Every Child Deserves, a battered library hand-me-down. That book and a fragile dream of a life like other children were all James possessed. At that precise moment, a sleek black car glided to a halt near the building. Nathaniel Grayson, a renowned real estate mogul architect of a vast financial empire, had just concluded an exhausting day. Stepping out of the car, reaching for his phone to summon his driver, his gaze fell upon James, soaked, shivering, yet fiercely clutching his book. "What are you doing out here in this downpour?" Nathaniel asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. James flinched instinctively, backing away like a stray animal accustomed to blows, not kindness. "I'm not asking for money." "I didn't assume you were," Nathaniel replied, his eyes taking in the boy's stoic misery. "I just see a young man who looks cold and is probably very hungry." Without another word, Nathaniel returned to his car. He reappeared moments later with a new sturdy backpack, a warm parcel of pastries, and a crisp business card. He placed them carefully in front of James. "If you ever need help, son, just text me one word. Help, I'll come." James said nothing, but his small, cold fingers closed around the business card as if it were a lifeline. The next morning, Hillary's sharp eyes latched onto the new backpack. "Where'd you steal this from?" she hissed. James remained mute. Roy, ever eager for a fight, grabbed the bag and tore it open. Finding nothing of immediate pawnable value, his face contorted in rage. "Trying to play games with me, huh? Think you're smart?" They dragged James into the backyard, shoved him violently into the chicken coop, the door slamming shut with a sound of grim finality. The rusty lock clicked. Inside, the stench of ammonia and decay was suffocating. Wind whistled through the myriad cracks in the rotting wood. James curled into a tight ball, pulling out a small, precious notebook. Its pages were filled with diary entries, meticulous, chilling accounts of every beating, every curse, every night, steeped in hopelessness. With a shard of broken wood, he scratched a message into the coop's decaying wall. "If you read this, please don't stay silent." In that suffocating darkness, James didn't sleep. He waited a silent vigil for a hand to pull him from this personal hell, or, at the very least, for the first defiant ray of dawn to pierce the gloom of the coop he was forced to call home. Meanwhile, across the sprawling, indifferent city, another man wrestled with sleeplessness. In a sleek, modern high-rise, ensconced in warmth, yet steeped in a profound hollowness, Nathaniel Grayson sat by his panoramic window. He gazed out over the glittering, impersonal skyline. Millions of lights, like scattered cold confetti, adorned the horizon. But not a single one could penetrate the emptiness in his chest. His thoughts drifted to the boy James. The matted hair, the torn shirt, the downcast eyes that nonetheless held an unbroken spark. A boy who didn't cry. Not because it didn't hurt, but because perhaps there was no one left to cry, with no one to offer solace. Where is he now? The thought, unbidden, sliced slowly, deeply. He rose, leaving the lights off, allowing the city's ambient glow to spill through the vast expanse of glass, illuminating a framed photograph on the wall. His son Michael, forever 10 a boy, who once called him Dad, with a voice like unfiltered sunlight. Nathaniel approached, gently placing a hand on the cool glass, his eyes clouded heavy with tears that rarely fell. "If you were still here, Mikey," he whispered, "you wouldn't let that boy sleep on the street, would you?" He had no idea of the coop of the daily torment, only the image of a child locked out in the rain. But as he'd driven through the quiet streets later that night, unable to shake the encounter, the image of James, thin, soaked to the bone, clutching that worn backpack, shivering yet refusing to bow his head, had seared itself into his memory. James. The name resonated within Nathaniel, a silent, deep wound, touching a part of his heart he believed had frozen solid the day his own son had passed away. Back in his luxurious, echoing apartment, he stood in the dark for a long time. The city's indifferent glow reflected off the photo of Michael, his bright eyes and radiant smile, a painful counterpoint to James's haunted gaze. Nathaniel reached out his fingers, tracing the outline of an old toy car on a shelf, a thin layer of dust coating its tiny wheels. Memories flooded back Michael's laughter in the backyard, the joyful shout of "Dad!" ringing through the air, a sound silenced too soon. And then James. Another boy about the same age, but with no sunlit backyard, no laughter, no treasured toy cars, only bruises, silence, and a chilling resilience. I should have done more then and there. Nathaniel whispered, his voice hoarse, as if addressing a departed soul. I should have insisted. Winter winds, sharp and unforgiving, sliced through the bare branches of the trees, carrying a stinging cold that bit at exposed skin. In a forgotten corner of a small park, beside the old apartment complex, an ancient gnarled tree stretched its roots above the frosted ground, like arthritic hands clinging to fading memories. This became James's precarious refuge when he could escape. He sat there silent and huddled his old coat of flimsy defense against the elements. Beside him lay the new backpack and the pastries still untouched. He was waiting. Familiar heavy footsteps crunched on the damp frozen ground. Nathaniel Grayson, the man who had knelt in the rain, had returned. He didn't speak at first. His expensive leather shoes came to a halt at the base of the tree, his long coat billowing slightly in the breeze, his silver-streaked hair a bit tousled. His eyes, filled with a deep, unreadable sorrow, settled on James. You came earlier than yesterday. Nathaniel observed, his voice deep and calm, devoid of pity, imbued only with a gentle, unwavering steadiness. James offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. No smile, no greeting, but in that shared silence there was a fragile acceptance. He pulled a worn book from his bag, Child Protection Laws. The cover was creased, the corners dog-eared from countless readings. I'm on Article 14, James murmured, his voice barely audible above the whistling wind. Every child has the right to live in a violence-free environment. Nathaniel turned his head, his brows furrowing a crease forming at the corner of his mouth. His eyes couldn't mask the complex emotions warring within him, bitterness, guilt, and a profound, echoing sorrow. A man who had lost his child, now listening to another child articulate the unspeakable cruelty he endured, using the sterile language of the law. He swallowed hard, steadying his voice. Why are you reading that, at your age, you should be drawing, playing, living freely, not this? James didn't answer. He just shrugged, a small, weary gesture that conveyed more pain than any words could. There were no tears in his eyes, but a heavy, impenetrable wall seemed to stand behind them, a bastion no one had ever dared to climb. Nathaniel remained silent, a stark realization dawning upon him. When a child matures too early, it is not a cause for praise, but an unspoken damning indictment of the adults in their life. He looked around the desolate park. Every frozen bench, every skeletal tree stood like a silent, complicit witness. A sense of unease, a quiet alarm stirred in his chest, ringing with an undeniable truth. In the days that followed, a new unspoken ritual formed in that small, forgotten park. An older man, wealthy and haunted, and a skinny, resilient boy sat together beneath the ancient tree. No intrusive noise, no endless probing questions. Just the quiet companionship of two souls adrift, allowing their shared presence to articulate what words could not yet voice. James began to open up fragment by painful fragment. He spoke of scavenging for recyclables to avoid beatings, of dinners consisting of nothing but dry bread crusts, of sneaking into the library. not for the stories, but for the dim hallway lights by which he could study desperately, clinging to a world beyond his suffering. All I want is a bed with a warm light above it. James confessed once, when Nathaniel gently asked what he wished for most. Nathaniel didn't answer immediately, but his hands resting on his lap clenched into tight, white-knuckled fists. A torrent of emotions surged within him. Anger at the world, at the injustice, perhaps even at himself for arriving too late, for not seeing sooner. One chilly afternoon, as the wind threaded its mournful song through the bare branches, James carefully dug a small hole beneath the tree. His small, calloused hands trembled slightly as he worked. "What are you doing?" Nathaniel asked, kneeling beside him, his voice low like wind brushing against dry leaves. James didn't respond immediately. He pulled out a small, worn wooden box, placed it reverently in the shallow depression, and then gently covered it with dry leaves and twigs. "If one day you don't see me here anymore." James said, his eyes fixed on the disturbed earth, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. "Look under this tree." Nathaniel held his breath. The vague fear that had been a constant companion since meeting James now solidified sharp and cold. It stabbed like a needle beneath his skin. "What's in there?" he asked, his own voice, barely a whisper. "Proof," James stated. "A journal, and something that shows I wasn't making it up." He hesitated, then added, "My rights book, in case they destroy the other one." Nathaniel slowly knelt, placing a firm hand on James's shoulder. For the first time, his eyes, usually filled with a gentle sorrow, now showed something clear, hard, and unshakable resolve. "You won't need that box to be found, James," he said, his voice imbued with a certainty that surprised even himself. "I promise you." James remained quiet for a few heartbeats, then nodded. A small, fragile nod, the gesture of someone placing their fragile trust onto another's shoulders for the very first time. That evening, as the anemic street lights flickered to life, casting long, distorted shadows, James stood up to leave. He turned back, his small voice carrying on the wind. "Thank you for just sitting with me." Nathaniel didn't reply, but he understood. Sometimes merely sitting quietly with a wounded child, without pressure, without pity, without demand, is the most potent form of healing. The wind rustled through the ancient trees, scattering a few dried leaves to the ground, like whispered portents of something momentous about to begin. And in that once meaningless place, a run-down park, a bare old tree, something sacred had been planted. Trust. James, the boy once locked in a chicken coop, had begun to tentatively open his heart, and Nathaniel, the grieving father with no biological ties, had stepped in gently but irrevocably. They didn't know it yet, but from that moment, their fates were inextricably entwined. That old tree, once mere shelter, would become the silent, steadfast witness to a difficult journey toward justice and perhaps toward love. A gloomy, oppressive morning. The streets were damp and slick after a light, persistent drizzle. While most children were being walked to school by their parents, chattering happily under colorful raincoats, James stood curled up in front of the soulless, bureaucratic facade of the social welfare office. The 10-year-old boy had been shoved there unceremoniously by Hillary and Roy. His hair was lank and faded, his shirt torn at the shoulder, exposing a bruise. His face wore a rehearsed expression of pitiful misery, the mask of an actor who knew his lines and the consequences of forgetting them all too well. Hillary gripped his arm with bruising tightness, her face a stony mask, and hissed through clenched teeth, "You remember what I told you. The second you speak, you cry. Cry like you've lost everything. Got it? If you don't bring back money, I'll smash your face in when we get home. You hear me, you useless little..." Roy stepped closer, his bulk intimidating, slapped James hard on the shoulder, making him stagger, and then leaned in his booze-soaked breath, a foul wave. "Act it out real good, kid, or you're sleeping with the chickens again." And this time, I'll wire the damn lock shut. No more screaming. I'm tired of your damn voice." Inside the welfare office waiting room, Hillary sat across from a harried caseworker, her voice syrupy sweet, her eyes performing the role of a devoted, struggling mother. "My boy. He's so frail. Been sickly since he was a baby. I work my fingers to the bone, and still I can't afford his medications. Please, ma'am, sir. We just need a little help just to tide us over." James sat silently behind her head, bowed, clutching tightly onto the small notebook hidden beneath his coat. Inside that notebook, like a tiny, meticulous detective, James was quietly building the case for the trial of his own life, dates, times, specific abuses, quotes. A young social worker, Sarah Evans, her eyes sharper than Hillary anticipated, noticed the distinct purplish bruise peeking from under James's sleeve. She leaned in gently, her voice soft. "Did you fall, sweetie?" James pressed his lips shut. He wasn't silent because he didn't know what to say. He was silent because he'd learned through bitter experience that speaking only invited more pain. Hillary quickly interjected with a brittle laugh. "Oh, he's such a handful. Climbed a tree the other day and took a tumble. Boys, you know, always getting into scrapes." But James's eyes, in one fleeting, unguarded, upward glance, sad, hollow, and almost numb, told a vastly different story. It was enough to make Sarah's breath hitch. She sat up straighter, scribbling extra notes into the file, a growing, undeniable sense of unease weighing heavily on her chest. After the meeting, Sarah and another young welfare staffer spoke in hushed tones in the hallway. "Something's profoundly off there," Sarah said, her voice tight. "That boy, it's not just poverty. He looks exploited, terrified." The other nodded grimly. "I felt it too. But they play their roles so well. Hillary's a master manipulator. There's no hard evidence, just a gut feeling." Sarah sighed. Maybe we should escalate it anyway. A concern report." At that same time, a few blocks away, Nathaniel Grayson stood in front of the public library, its stone facade a haven for James. He was speaking with Matilda, the head librarian, a woman whose stern demeanor concealed a keen intellect and a surprisingly tender heart. "That boy, James," Nathaniel began, his voice low and heavy. "Does he still come here every week?" Matilda, who initially saw James as just another bookish child, adjusted her glasses. "Yes, Mr. Grayson, he does. But lately, he's changed. He's not like the other children. He devours books on law, child protection statutes, human rights. And he writes constantly in those little notebooks. I used to think he was just exceptionally bright. Now," she paused, her gaze direct and piercing, "now I think he's meticulously documenting his own torment, crying out for help in the only way he knows how." Her voice sharpened, shedding any semblance of mere librarian. "Mr. Grayson, I wasn't always just stacking books. For 15 years, I was a CPS frontline investigator. I've seen more darkness than most, and I know the stench of it when it clings to a child." Nathaniel nodded, a grim understanding passing between them. He didn't say that since that rainy night, he'd quietly begun gathering every piece of information he could about James, driven by a deep, instinctive pull. Save this child, a voice in his soul whispered, before it's truly too late. This was the twist Matilda now shared, and Hillary Vaughn. She said, her voice dropping to a near whisper freighted with old disgust. "I remember her. 17, pregnant, manipulative, even then. Her caseworker was a colleague, Maria Sanchez. Maria agonized over that case, tried everything. Hillary was already enmeshed with users and petty criminals. Spat in Maria's face, accused her of harassment. When Maria heard Hillary had a son years later, she was concerned, to say the least. She even started an unofficial watch file, things she'd hear on the grapevine. Maria passed away a few years ago, Mr. Grayson, pancreatic cancer. before she died knowing my connection to this library, this neighborhood. She gave me her notes. "For the boy," she said, "if he ever shows up." Matilda's eyes hardened. "She's a viper, Mr. Grayson, and that boy is her prey. The USBs James gives me aren't just for safekeeping. He's giving them to someone who knew Maria Sanchez, someone who understands the system's failings and the specific brand of poison Hillary deals in." Back at their hovel, Roy forced James to accompany him on his scavenging rounds, dragging a heavy sack of recyclables that bruised his small shoulders and scraped his legs raw. Hillary walked ahead, her eyes darting into trash bins, a vulture searching for scraps. "Move it," she snapped. "You always look like you've got rocks in your head. Want dinner tonight or not?" Roy found an empty beer can, and with a cruel flick of his wrist, threw it at James's head. "See, this other kids are in proper school. You're just a useless waste of space. Should have drowned you at birth, would have saved us all a lot of trouble and food." People passed by. Some cast fleeting, uncomfortable glances, but none stopped, none intervened. They moved past him like wind through a broken pane of glass. And James, 10 years old, frail, dragging a sack heavier than himself, became just another blur in the city's indifferent, unseeing crowd. As daylight faded, the evening breeze swept through the streets, carrying the enticing aroma of street food from a nearby night market. A vibrant splash of color and noise that James only ever observed from the periphery, like a ghost. He watched a group of students walk past in their crisp white uniforms, laughing and carefree figures from a world he could only dream of, a world he never dared to believe he could touch. James intensified his efforts gathering the truth with a chilling focus. He hid rudimentary recording devices salvaged from discarded electronics inside the hollowed-out covers of library books. He used a discarded, cracked smartphone he'd found in a junkyard, charging it precariously whenever he could, meticulously recording Roy's threats, Hillary's venomous insults, the sound of blows, even his own muffled, desperate sobs. Every evening he could escape. He returned to the sanctuary of the library. Matilda, her initial impression of James as merely a book-loving child, long since replaced by a grim understanding, began noticing the hardened, almost feral look in his eyes. A look no 10-year-old should carry, cold, wary, and utterly devoid of any expectation of kindness. James took long, circuitous detours, circling blocks to avoid Roy's increasingly paranoid suspicions. He wasn't allowed to visit the library. He wasn't allowed to take anything from the house that wasn't trash. But today, he took a significant risk for a dream that needed a secure hiding place. One evening, James quietly handed Matilda a copy of A History of Children's Rights. He didn't say much, just placed it gently into her hands, his small voice a mere whisper. "Keep this safe, Miss Matilda. There's something important inside. For Mr. Grayson, when the time is right." Inside, nestled between the pages, was a USB drive containing the latest recordings, more journal entries, and a crudely drawn map of the Co-op marking where he'd hidden other evidence. The truth in digital and handwritten fragments. That night, back in the damp, fetid chicken coop, James wrote in his notebook again, his fingers stiff with cold. "Today, Roy hit me with a beer bottle because I looked at him wrong. Mum watched. Said I deserved it. I managed to get the recorder under the kitchen table before. Matilda has a copy. If something happens to me, they'll know." He returned to the rotting wooden wall, and with a sharp stone carved again the words that had become his desperate mantra. "If you find this, please don't stay silent." That frail small boy was fighting like a seasoned warrior, not with fists, but with words, with evidence, with the unyielding power of truth. On the surface, Roy and Hillary continued their charade as struggling, misunderstood poor folk. But they didn't know. Their script was unraveling thread by painstaking thread. And the child they deemed so easy to control, so broken, was the very one dismantling their web of lies. Elsewhere beneath the ancient tree where two disparate souls often met, always under the cloak of night when the city dimmed and quieted, Nathaniel continued his vigil. Some nights he brought a new book, a warm drink. Some nights he just sat staring into the oppressive darkness, as if listening to something far away, a distant echo of his own past pain. Days passed, but James didn't return to the park. Nathaniel stood there long after the sky turned a desolate slate gray, a chilling premonition coiling in his gut. He placed a familiar book on the cold bench, Children's Rights, the one James favored, a silent promise. He didn't know the specifics, but he knew with a certainty that terrified him that something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. Matilda's recent urgent message about escalating violence painted a grim picture. Maybe it was close now, he thought. Maybe the mask was about to shatter and the raw, unvarnished truth would finally be called by its rightful name. What James didn't know yet was this: there were adults bruised by their own pasts and failures, now beginning to kneel not in pity, but to finally truly listen. That night, a cold, vicious wind pierced through the coop's inadequate wooden walls. James lay curled in the suffocating dark, his eyes wide open, staring into nothingness. He no longer cried. Tears had long since run dry, but inside him brewed a storm not of fear, but of a steely, unwavering will. The information passed to Matilda, then to Nathaniel, had to be enough. He didn't know if this time the adults would believe him, would act decisively, but he kept his small makeshift recorder close. He kept his mind sharp, and most of all, he kept waiting. The next morning dawned gray and menacing. James was yanked from a fitful sleep before sunrise, hurriedly shoved into an ill-fitting old shirt, and pushed into the back seat of Roy's battered car. "Act properly," Hillary hissed through clenched teeth, her eyes flashing. "It's a church-run summer camp, free meals and some lessons. But if you say one wrong word, one syllable out of line, you know what happens when you get back." James didn't ask why his mother, who usually hoarded every penny and resented every mouthful he ate, suddenly wanted him to go. He didn't expect much from the trip, but deep down, a tiny, stubborn ember of hope flickered. Maybe somewhere out there someone would listen without needing him to beg, without requiring a performance of misery. Maybe this time would be different. The summer camp, organized by Pastor Harold Green's local church, was nestled away from the city's grime, hidden beyond a stretch of verdant green trees, where the buzz of cicadas and the songs of birds blended with the distant, alien sound of children's laughter. Canvas tents lined the sun-drenched field, radiating an atmosphere of joy and normalcy that was utterly foreign to James. When he stepped out of the car, he simply stood still, a small, shadowy figure amidst the bright colors, looking like a startled fawn. He didn't run, he didn't smile. He retreated to a wooden bench beneath a large oak, watching everything with guarded, assessing eyes. Pastor Harold Green, the camp's director, a man in his late 50s with kind, crinkling eyes and a smile as warm as the morning sun, walked slowly over. He didn't speak right away, just sat beside James in companionable silence. "What's your name, son?" he asked gently. After a few minutes, his voice resonant and calm, a voice that instinctively inspired trust. "James." The boy's voice was barely audible, hoarse, as if every sound within him had long been locked away, gathering dust. "Can you read James?" The boy nodded. Pastor Harold's voice softened further, full of earnest encouragement. "Later, when everyone gathers for campfire, would you like to read something you like? Or perhaps tell us a story? The bravest stories, James, aren't always about slaying dragons. Sometimes they're about daring to speak your truth, however small your voice feels. We're listening." James froze for a moment, visibly taken aback. He had never stood in front of a group, never been asked what he liked. That night, under the soft, inviting glow of campfire lanterns, children lined up eager to share their dreams, their funny stories, their aspirations. James, encouraged by a soft nod from Pastor Harold, stepped onto the small makeshift stage, his legs trembling slightly. He held a shaky sheet of paper lyrics to a song he'd copied. But then he looked up, his gaze sweeping over the expectant faces, and spoke, his voice small but clear in the sudden hush. "I don't have a big dream," he began, his voice gaining a fragile strength. "I just want a place to sleep where the door isn't locked from the outside. A light that stays on at night so I'm not always in the dark. And maybe someone to ask me how my day was." A silence fell so profound it seemed to swallow the chirping of crickets in the surrounding woods. In the shadows at the edge of the gathering, a man stood quietly. Nathaniel Grayson. He had arranged with Pastor Harold, a man he knew through his charitable foundation, to attend the program anonymously, to observe James in a different setting. As James spoke, Nathaniel closed his eyes, a familiar weight pressing down on his chest. His own son, Michael, in the last difficult weeks of his illness, had once whispered similar heartbreakingly simple desires. Pastor Harold didn't move. Those words, simple, honest, and devastatingly raw, landed like a physical blow to the hearts of everyone present. The entire camp seemed to hold its breath. Then a single tentative clap. Then another. And then the entire assembly rose to their feet, not out of pity, but out of a profound, astonished respect for a boy who had dared to speak his unvarnished truth. Matilda, the librarian, was there that night, too, invited by Pastor Harold at Nathaniel's discreet suggestion. She placed a hand over her chest, feeling her heart tighten. And in that moment, seeing James standing there, small but unbowed, she saw something flicker in his eyes. Not just sadness, but an indomitable strength. A new beginning. Pastor Harold didn't just clap. Visibly moved, he turned, walked straight to his small office, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and wrote a letter that same night. A formal, urgent report to Child Protective Services, attaching a recording he'd discreetly made of James's speech. He had encountered many abandoned, neglected children in his years of ministry. But James was more than just hurt. He was a spark stubbornly flaring in a suffocatingly dark room. Not large, but bright enough to declare, life is still here. Hope is still here. That night, Pastor Harold found Nathaniel lingering by his car. "You know that boy far better than I realized, Nathaniel." Nathaniel's voice was gravelly. "Because I once lost a boy, just like him, Harold. A boy whose quiet pleas I didn't fully understand until it was too late. This time I won't lose again." That same evening, Nathaniel texted Matilda. "Send me everything you have. The raw recordings, photocopies of the journal pages, Maria Sanchez's file, the exact address, any neighbors who might have seen or heard anything. It's time, Matilda. It's past time someone did what an adult is supposed to do, the right way, the decisive way." When James got home from camp, Roy's greeting was a vicious slap across the face at the front door. "What the hell kind of stunt were you pulling back there, you little snitch?" Hillary yanked the camp-issued backpack off James's shoulders, rummaging through every pocket with frantic suspicion. "Nothing," she growled, finding only a few crafts and pamphlets. "But from now on, you're not going anywhere unless I'm breathing down your neck. Got it?" James only nodded, his cheek, stinging his brief respite shattered. But that night, in the oppressive dark of the chicken coop, he carefully opened the cheap plastic wristwatch he'd been given as a camp souvenir. Tucked inside the back plate where the battery should be was a tiny hidden memory card holding a copy of his speech and Pastor Harold's compassionate, horrified response. James had started fighting back with his mind, his resilience, his incredible, heartbreaking ingenuity. One evening, he spotted Hillary at the kitchen table, hunched over financial aid forms, scribbling furiously. James, pretending to search for a fallen pencil, quietly observed. He noticed discrepancies, names that weren't theirs, forged signatures, account numbers that seemed to materialize from thin air. Hillary was deeply enmeshed in welfare fraud. Casually, he dropped his notebook to the floor, and as he bent to retrieve it, the old phone in his pocket, angled perfectly, began recording her muttering calculations and damning admissions. The next day, the flimsy house was torn apart by Roy's paranoia. "Someone snitched, I know it. Someone's been listening, watching." He suspected James, his eyes burning with accusation. But James had already moved the critical evidence. A recording device hidden inside a hollowed-out pencil case. A USB drive sealed with tape beneath the loose lid of an empty soda can he'd retrieved from the trash. He was learning misdirection feints, the grim tactics of a child soldier in a domestic war. Roy barked, his face inches from James's. "You've been spying on us, huh? Who'd you tell? Talk, you little bastard." James simply shrugged, a quiet, infuriating defiance. That silence drove Roy into a frenzy. But James didn't cry. And that very silence, that refusal to break, was what began to instill a sliver of fear in his tormentors. That night, James feigned sleep, his small chest rising and falling rhythmically. His jacket, draped over the edge of his makeshift bed of sacks, bulged slightly, concealing another active recorder. In the kitchen, Roy and Hillary argued, their voices rising and falling, about how to split the latest ill-gotten welfare check. Every insult, every incriminating word, every casual admission of neglect and cruelty was meticulously recorded. At the library, Matilda, no longer just a passive recipient, was now an active co-conspirator in James's fight for freedom. "Mr. Grayson," she'd said on their last call, her voice crisp. "I've cross-referenced James's entries with Maria's old files on Hillary. The pattern is undeniable, almost textbook. This isn't just neglect, it's systemic psychological warfare. The kind of thing that either breaks a child or forges them into something else." She quietly created a new internal record, meticulously cataloging James's evidence under "Children at Extreme Risk of Abuse, Urgent, Arif M. Sanchez Legacy File." She photographed James's journal entries, downloaded the contents of each USB drive, and uploaded them to an encrypted cloud account, the credentials for which she had already passed to Nathaniel Grayson. Nathaniel now visited the library almost nightly, under the pretext of research, anxiously awaiting updates from Matilda on James. Nathaniel sat in his car late one night, parked in a shadowy street near James's neighborhood, listening to the recording of James's speech at camp. The initial nervous tremor in the boy's voice, the gasps from the audience, the heartfelt, spontaneous applause, the quiet, choked sobs of some listeners, and then that trembling yet undeniably firm voice. "I don't want to be silent anymore." Nathaniel's eyes darkened. His grip tightened on the steering wheel until his knuckles were white. A flash of lightning illuminated the sky beyond the windshield, briefly silhouetting the rundown houses. It was time. Past time, not to act as a millionaire dispensing charity from a safe distance, but as the one person, perhaps the only person, James still clung to, a fragile shred of hope in. Back in the coop, as another storm raged outside, James carved another line into the decaying wood near his original plea. "They can lock the door, but they can't lock my will." The grown-ups' carefully constructed performance was unraveling, and James's story, born in darkness and despair, was only just beginning. After the brief respite of summer camp, James thought he might finally catch his breath, experience a few days of relative peace. But mere days after returning, his fragile world shattered. Roy, the man James had never once dared to call Dad, transformed from a casual tormentor into something far more terrifying, something utterly unhinged. He didn't scream as much anymore. His rage became cold, calculating. He acted. He didn't strike with belts or open hands as before. He punched, hard, with closed fists, to the head, to the ribs. Every time he got high or angry, over some imagined slight or simply because James was there, he unleashed a brutal, terrifying violence on James's small, unresisting body. The boy was slammed into walls with sickening thuds. His nose bled frequently, the metallic taste of blood, a constant companion. Still not a single cry escaped his lips. Hillary, the woman who should have been a mother, just stood nearby, arms crossed, her voice like jagged ice. "You live in my house. You eat my food. That means I own you. Do as you're told and shut up." James was dragged almost senseless back to the chicken coop. The metal door, once just creaky, now clanged shut with brutal finality. The rusty lock was reinforced, tightened with a thick loop of wire, making escape impossible. Inside, a few torn, filthy sacks lay on the damp earth. The stench of old chicken droppings, urine, and something else, decay perhaps, or utter despair, was thick enough to choke the air. He sagged in a dark corner, his back pressed against the cold, rotting wood, silently watching a lone, scrawny hen nesting nearby. The bird had just laid a few precious eggs, tucking her head protectively over her potential chicks, gently pecking at a few scattered moldy grains. James managed a smile, a ghost of a smile so small, so fleeting, it would have broken any compassionate heart. Even a chicken protects its young. What did his mother see him as less than nothing? Something to be discarded like refuse. He bent down, his fingers numb, dug a sharp splinter of wood into the wall, and carved again, deeper this time. "If you find this, please don't stay silent. Please." It rained. Heavy, relentless drops drummed on the rusted tin roof, echoing like a slow, mournful dirge for a weary soul. James clutched his worn-out jacket, the fabric thin and offering little warmth, and closed his eyes. But he didn't sleep. He couldn't. He was waiting not necessarily to be rescued anymore. That hope had dwindled to a dying ember. But for something from the outside world. A light, a voice, or even just a spark, a sign that he hadn't been entirely forgotten. Across the yard, Mrs. Holloway, the weary elderly landlady who rented the main house to Hillary and Roy, heard something deeply unsettling in the dead of night. At first, she tried to dismiss it, attributing the muffled thuds, the soft, choked cries, and then the distinct, sharp sound of the reinforced lock slamming shut to her overactive imagination. She pressed her ear to the thin wall, her heart pounding, hesitant, afraid. "It's not my business," a cowardly voice whispered. "But it is wrong," another stronger voice countered. She recalled her late husband, a stern but fair police officer. "Silence, Martha," he'd often say about witnessing injustice, "is just another word for complicity." The next morning, her hands trembled as she brewed her tea, the memory of those sickening sounds replaying. That gnawing conscience, that sharp, insistent ache spurred her. At the local market, she spoke, her voice lowered to a vendor she trusted. "The little boy at Geller's last night was bad. Worse than usual." The vendor just shook her head sadly. "Awful people. But what can we do?" Frustrated but resolute, Mrs. Holloway didn't go to the police station this time. She'd tried that route before, about Roy's loud, drunken parties, only to be met with bureaucratic indifference. Instead, she went to the public library. She found Matilda shelving books. "Miss Matilda." She began, her voice trembling but firm. "I need to talk to you about James, the boy who lives with the Gellers. Last night, I heard things. Terrible things." Matilda's expression, already grim when James was mentioned, sharpened. "Sit down, Mrs. Holloway. Tell me everything. And if you've seen anything, no matter how small." Mrs. Holloway confessed her shame at her earlier inaction, then recounted the horrors. "And well," she faltered, A few weeks ago, I saw Roy dragging him to that dreadful Coop. James dropped something, a little notebook. Roy didn't see. I picked it up later. I read a page. It was... Oh, God. She fumbled in her purse, producing a small, cheap notebook. I haven't told anyone. I was scared. But I can't stay silent anymore, not after last night. This notebook wasn't James's primary evidence journal, but a smaller, sparser one detailing mostly the dates and times of being locked out, almost a logbook of confinement. Matilda took it, her fingers surprisingly steady. You did the right thing, Martha. The very right thing. In the Coop, James, feeling a strange, cold lucidity, pulled his main small, almost full notebook, a cheap pen, and the critical USB stick from a loose plank where he'd hidden them. He wrote, his handwriting surprisingly steady despite the shivering cold. I don't know if I'll be alive to see tomorrow. But if someone reads this, please believe me. And don't stay silent, like everyone else did. He folded the notebook, carefully tucked the USB inside, and hid it deep within a crack in the wooden wall. Only he knew about covering it with dirt and a loose stone. His hands trembled, but his eyes, when he looked towards the locked door, shone with a defiant, almost unearthly light. He wasn't begging, wasn't crying, wasn't giving in. He was waiting for one thing only: for the truth to be heard, to be acknowledged. Even if it came from a forgotten chicken coop, from behind rotting hay bales, or from the echoes of silent screams, James still clung to a desperate, irrational belief someone would come. And out there, someone was coming. Nathaniel Grayson. And the man James had met only a few times, under the shelter of an old tree, now sat in his car a block away, his face illuminated by the harsh glow of his laptop screen. He was reviewing the comprehensive file Matilda had emailed him, not just James's journal entries and audio. Matilda's own meticulous notes from her past encounters with Hilary Maria Sanchez's legacy file, news clippings of Roy's previous minor arrests, Pastor Harold's CPS report, but now also a scanned copy of Mrs. Holloway's brave, terrified statement, and the few pages from the notebook she'd recovered. He's going to kill that boy. I hear it. Please help. Nathaniel looked out at the rain, lashing against his windshield. His mind, usually a whirlwind of business strategy and financial projections, was now icily clear. It was time to stop observing from the sidelines. It was time to tear down a door. Inside him burned a quiet, controlled fury. The fury of impotence, of grief, of once being devastatingly, irretrievably too late to save his own son. This time, he swore he would not be. He turned on the car's interior light and flipped to the last image Matilda had sent, a photo of James at the summer camp speaking on stage. Eyes wide and haunted shoulders impossibly thin, but undeniably upright. That boy had stood up. Now it was time for the adults, for him to act. He picked up his phone, his fingers flying across the screen, not to Matilda, but to his head of security, a former Special Forces operative. Marcus, Code Echo. The address I sent. Silent approach, full observation. I suspect extreme child endangerment. Police are en route but might be too slow. I'm going in. If you hear anything, breach. Rower. He then dialed 911, his voice calm but steel-edged, reporting a child in imminent mortal danger, giving the address and names referencing Pastor Harold's earlier CPS report and the corroborating evidence from a neighbor now documented by Matilda, and mentioning his own identity to ensure an immediate, high-priority response. Before the sun had even thought about sullying the bruised pre-dawn sky, 2 city police patrol cars, sirens off, quietly converged on the rundown house at the desolate end of the alley. Detective Charles Morton, a veteran with weary eyes that had seen too much, and 3 uniformed officers stared at the dilapidated front door. Nathaniel was already there, concealed in the shadows of a neighboring derelict building, having arrived moments before, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He saw a faint light flicker in the coop, then another from the main house kitchen. A muffled shout. His stomach clenched. He couldn't wait. Inside the main house, Roy, coked up and paranoid, paced like a caged animal, the same hunting knife he'd held to James's throat clutched in his sweating hand. James, retrieved from the coop hours earlier for some new terrifying lesson, was now tied to a rickety kitchen chair with frayed electrical cords, a filthy, moldy cloth stuffed brutally into his mouth, tasting of dirt and despair. His small body trembled uncontrollably, new bruises blooming like grotesque flowers across his thin frame. His face was swollen, his lips bloodied and split. Hope, which had flickered with Pastor Harold and Nathaniel, was nearly extinguished. Now there was only a numb, desperate prayer for it all to end. Roy growled his voice, a low, menacing rumble. Stepping closer, the knife glinting. "You think you can record me snitch on me? Set me up with your fancy friends? I'll show you what betrayal feels like, you little bastard. I'll carve it into you." He raised the knife. James squeezed his eyes shut, a single hot tear finally escaping, tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. At that exact instant, a shadow detached itself from the deeper gloom outside the kitchen window. Nathaniel. He'd seen the raised knife. He didn't shout. He acted. With a primal roar born of fury and a grief he thought long buried, he smashed through the flimsy back door splinters, flying like shrapnel. Roy spun, startled eyes wide with disbelief and rage. "You," he snarled. Nathaniel, fueled by adrenaline and a father's protective instinct so raw it seared his soul, barreled into him a human battering ram. The knife clattered to the floor, skittering under the grimy stove. Roy, heavier but caught off guard, stumbled back, bellowing. He scrambled, kicking Nathaniel in the shin, and then with a desperate lunge grabbed James, yanking him up by the ropes, the chair scraping violently. "Stay back, Grayson, or the kid gets it," Roy screamed, one arm clamped around James's neck, the boy choking against the gag. He began dragging James towards the splintered back door, clearly intending to use him as a shield. James's eyes, wide with terror, met Nathaniel's across the wrecked kitchen. He could hear the thud of boots' shouts from the front. "Please," his eyes screamed, "don't let him take me." Simultaneously, the front door burst open. "Police, don't move," Detective Morton shouted, weapon drawn. The uniformed officers fanned out. Roy, seeing his escape route cut off, tightened his grip on James. "I ain't going back. You hear me? Nobody's taking him." "Let the boy go, Geller." Morton commanded, his voice rock steady despite the pounding in his own chest. Nathaniel, agony twisting his features, saw the wild terror in Roy's eyes, the desperation of a cornered animal. "Roy, listen to me." Nathaniel said, his voice surprisingly calm, holding his hands up. "It's over. Don't make it worse. Just let him go." Hillary ran from the bedroom, then her face a mask of contrived hysteria, screaming, "You've got the wrong house. He's my son. I have rights. I gave birth to him." Two officers swiftly restrained her. She flailed, spewing obscenities, but her eyes, when they met Nathaniel's blazing gaze over Roy's struggling form, no longer resembled those of a mother. They were the eyes of a cornered viper, her carefully constructed mask finally irrevocably torn away. Roy, thrashing slightly, tried to drag James further, but tripped over the fallen chair. For a split second, his grip loosened. Nathaniel saw his chance. He launched himself forward again, not at Roy, but low, tackling Roy's legs. Roy crashed to the ground, losing his hold on James, who tumbled free. Before Roy could recover, an officer was on him, another delivering a short, sharp burst from a taser. Roy convulsed and then lay still, groaning. Signs of forcible confinement in the backyard coop. An officer called from outside. Electrical cords, bloodstains on the floor here, another knife in a kitchen drawer. The place, is a hellhole. Nathaniel, shaking, adrenaline coursing through him, scrambled to James. He gently, almost reverently, untied the cords, his fingers fumbling, then carefully removed the gag. The cloth left raw red marks around James's small mouth. His forehead was swollen, his arms covered in fresh scratches and older faded scars. James coughed, gasping for air, then looked around the chaotic kitchen at the uniformed officers, at Nathaniel's anguished face, stunned, unsure if this was real, if he was truly finally free. Detective Morton knelt beside him, his voice surprisingly gentle, placing a steady, reassuring hand on his shoulder. "James," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "James, you're safe now. It's over." Nathaniel sank to his knees, tears streaming down his face, and gathered the boy into his arms, holding him as if he were the most precious, fragile thing in the world. James didn't resist. He didn't cling. He just lay limp, a small, broken bird, finally impossibly safe in the eye of the storm. And the distant scent of the pastries Nathaniel had once given him a strange, hopeful memory in the miasma of the kitchen. 3 weeks later, the courtroom was packed. Media access had been strictly barred, but the air inside was thick with a palpable, heavy tension. James sat beside Nathaniel, wearing a new, neatly pressed gray suit that felt alien on his small frame. His eyes, though, were sharp, steady. He was there not just to recount his horrific story, but to reclaim his life, to demand justice. Across the room, Roy and Hillary sat at the defendant's table, flanked by their public defenders, looking sullen and defeated. They didn't speak much because they didn't have to. James's meticulously collected evidence, his audio files, his journal now recovered from the Coop wall, spoke with devastating clarity. Mrs. Holloway's tearful, resolute testimony about the noises and the notebook she'd found, Matilda the librarian's calm, damning statement, detailing her history with Hillary and Maria Sanchez's prophetic warnings, and James's increasingly desperate visits, and Pastor Harold Green's eloquent account of the summer camp speech, painted a vivid, unassailable picture of prolonged, sadistic abuse. The lead prosecutor, a formidable woman named A.D. Miller, laid out the facts with chilling precision. Roy Geller, she detailed, had a prior sealed juvenile record for violent assault, a fact Matilda's historical knowledge combined with Maria Sanchez's files had helped unearth. Weapons restraints and clear, undeniable signs of systemic abuse were found throughout the house and Coop. James had been repeatedly locked in the chicken coop, beaten, starved, and systematically terrorized. Hillary Vaughn Miller continued, had not only been complicit in the abuse and unlawful imprisonment, but had actively exploited James for illegal welfare claims, forged medical documents to support her fraudulent claims, and emotionally annihilated her own child. Matilda's earlier testimony about Hillary's manipulative past as a teen, now supported by the historical context from Maria Sanchez's diligent, if unofficial work, provided crucial context to her current deceptions. The courtroom fell into a profound, aching silence as James was called to the stand. He walked forward, his small figure strangely dignified, without looking at Hillary or Roy, clutching his prepared statement tightly. He spoke, his voice soft but unwavering, each word resonating with hard-won truth. He began, his gaze fixed on the judge. "I don't hate them, but I don't want to be beaten anymore, or locked up, or called names. I just want to be safe, like other kids." He paused, his eyes lifting, glistening, but no tears fell. "I wrote something in the chicken coop. It said, 'If you find this, please don't stay silent.' Today," his voice caught slightly, "I want to thank Mr. Grayson, Pastor Harold, Miss Matilda, and Mrs. Holloway, because you didn't stay silent." Witnesses came forward. Mrs. Holloway, no longer hesitant, but consumed by a fierce protective anger, recounted the sounds, the fear, and the notebook she'd shown Matilda. "That boy, He deserved so much better. I should have spoken sooner, louder. Matilda clutched the copy of Children's Rights. James had hidden the USB in her voice, cracking with emotion, but underpinned with a core of steel. That library, Your Honor, was his only sanctuary. And that boy with his notebooks and his whispered requests, he wasn't just asking for safekeeping. He was building an ark fragment by fragment against a coming flood. Maria Sanchez saw the storm clouds gathering years ago. James lived through the deluge. Pastor Harold recounted James's summer camp speech, his voice heavy. The recording of James's small, brave voice filled the courtroom, and the entire assembly held its breath, many openly weeping. Finally, Nathaniel stood. He wore a dark blue suit, elegant but understated. In his hand, he held a thick file. It contained audited financial records, extensive psychological evaluations, his own, and plans for James' proof of a stable, loving home environment he could provide, and enrollment confirmations in specialized post-trauma therapy programs for James to be led by top child psychologists. Your Honor. He began, his voice deep, calm, and resolute, his gaze fixed on the judge but encompassing James with a profound tenderness. I did not give life to James Whitman, but I am ready with every fiber of my being to be his father. I cannot erase the years of suffering he has endured, but I promise, here and now, I will help him rebuild what comes next, brick by painstaking brick. He glanced at James, his eyes misty but unwavering. I am the CEO of Grayson Global Holdings. My net worth is substantial, and I have already established the James Whitman Future Fund, an irrevocable trust to ensure his lifelong education, care, and protection, regardless of my own future circumstances. All relevant documentation regarding living conditions, extensive support teams, and mental health specialists are before you. He paused, then continued, his voice ringing with conviction. I believe that when this court decides on guardianship, it should consider not only the tragic failings of biology, but the undeniable power of the heart. And my heart, Your Honor, chose James the moment I saw him huddled and alone in the rain, clinging to a book as if it were his only shield against the world. James looked up at him, his eyes for so long guarded and haunted now filled with an almost unbearable dawning trust. For the first time during the entire ordeal, a small, tentative smile touched his lips. The judge, a man known for his stern demeanor but fair judgments, nodded slowly, visibly moved. His voice, when it came, rang out with authority. After careful review of all evidence, presented the witness statements, the damning exhibits, and the comprehensive future care plan submitted by Mr. Grayson, and noting the defendants' complete lack of remorse and their heinous crimes. This court hereby terminates all parental rights of Hillary Vaughn and Roy Geller. Full legal guardianship of James Whitman is granted to Mr. Nathaniel Grayson. A collective sigh, a release of long-held tension, swept through the room. Nathaniel turned to James. He didn't speak. He simply opened his arms. James hesitated for a heartbeat, then launched himself into them. His small shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. His head rested on Nathaniel's chest, feeling a strong, steady heartbeat, a rhythm of safety he had never known. For the first time in his life, he felt a profound, unconditional peace. He looked up, tears shimmering in his eyes, but they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of release, of belonging. And then he whispered so soft, it was almost lost, but resonant enough to move everyone who heard it. Dad, we have a home now. Nathaniel nodded, his arms tightening around him, as if to make up for all the lost years, all the stolen moments. Yes, son, he choked out. Yes, we do. Roy Geller was sentenced to the maximum of 25 years in a state penitentiary for aggravated child abuse, use of a deadly weapon, unlawful imprisonment, and multiple counts of welfare fraud. Hillary Vaughn received 18 years for complicity in abuse, aggravated child endangerment, and extensive fraud. As Roy was escorted out handcuffed and snarling, he screamed, "You ungrateful little brat, I raised you. This is how you repay me." Hillary said nothing. She simply lowered her head, finally avoiding James's gaze, a gaze no longer filled with fear or hatred, but with a quiet, solemn release. The courtroom doors closed. One brutal chapter had ended. Another, luminous with hope, began with two quiet, powerful words: freedom, family. As the heavy courtroom doors closed behind him, James stood quietly in the echoing hallway, his legs trembling with a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. But there was no fear in his eyes. No ropes. No more of Roy's terrifying bellowed threats. No more of the cold, empty stares from a mother who had once casually left him to sleep among chickens and filth. Nathaniel approached and knelt on one knee in front of him, bringing their eyes to a level. "You did so well, James," he said, his voice low and still shaking with emotion. "You were so brave. From today on, son, you're not alone anymore. Never again." James looked at him, his eyes red-rimmed but dry. What he felt was something utterly unfamiliar, a sensation he couldn't quite name. Safety. I don't know how to live without being afraid." James whispered the admission, a stark revelation of his young life's pervasive terror. Nathaniel gently took his small, scarred hand, his grip warm and firm. "Then we'll learn together, James. One step, one day at a time, you and me." James nodded slowly. He didn't smile, not yet. But inside, something profound shifted. A soft, hesitant heartbeat in a place once filled only with chilling darkness and a desperate, silent plea. After the trial, expertly managed leaks ensured James's story, carefully anonymized to protect his new life, but with enough detail to convey the horror, spread across news outlets nationwide. The image described by journalists of words scratched into rotting wood. "If you find this, please don't stay silent." Moved millions to tears and outrage. News anchors passionately condemned the monstrous cruelty of the mother and her partner. But hearts also swelled at the sight of Nathaniel Grayson, the renowned, fiercely private businessman, once publicly broken by his own family tragedy, now standing before a select group of press, his arm protectively around James, whose face was obscured, declaring, "I will not just provide for James financially. That is the easy part. I will strive to give him the unwavering love, the security, and the guidance he should have had from the very beginning." The adoption process, with the court's prior termination of parental rights and strong recommendation, moved with astonishing swiftness. Nathaniel's legal team, armed with impeccable documentation, presented an unassailable case. A respected businessman with a spotless public record, verified substantial assets, a documented history of quiet, impactful philanthropy, and the powerful testimonies from the trial. He had already proven both in sworn testimony and through decisive action that he was more than worthy of guardianship. The family court judge, familiar with Nathaniel's sterling reputation and moved by the extraordinary circumstances, didn't hesitate to approve the adoption petition. James moved into Nathaniel's spacious penthouse apartment, which, to his surprise, overlooked the very park and the very ancient tree where their unlikely friendship had first taken root. Despite his immense wealth, Nathaniel lived with an understated elegance rather than ostentatious luxury. The home was warm, refined, and inviting. Polished oak floors glowed underfoot, walls were painted in soft, calming tones of beige and cream, and ambient golden lighting wrapped each room in a serene, peaceful calm. The expansive living room held a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf crammed with books of every genre, a few striking, abstract paintings. And on a grand piano, a single poignant framed photo, Nathaniel, a beautiful brown-haired woman, with a kind smile, his late wife Elena, and a younger laughing boy with bright, mischievous eyes, Michael. On his first night there, James stared at that photograph for a long contemplative time. He didn't ask questions. He simply reached out a small hand, his fingers gently tracing the outline of the smiling faces, and whispered so softly, Nathaniel almost didn't hear. "I know. They'll always have a very special place in your heart. I won't ever try to replace them. But I hope maybe I can be a small new part of this family too." Nathaniel, his throat tight with emotion, pulled James into a hug. No grand promises were needed. Just a quiet, heartfelt embrace, powerful enough to warm two souls once fractured by loss and pain. James's new room wasn't excessively large or grand, but it held every meticulously chosen piece of his once impossible dream. A sturdy wooden bed with a fluffy blue comforter, a warm yellow nightlight that cast comforting shadows, a polished desk facing the window offering a view of the city lights, and a small handcrafted bookshelf that Nathaniel, to James's astonishment and delight, had built with his own hands over the preceding weeks. The walls were painted a pale, tranquil blue. James's hesitant choice, when asked for the very first time in his life, "What do you want your room to look like, son?" At night, there were no more jolting awakenings to the sound of slamming doors or enraged drunken voices. No more desperate need to hide USB drives or journal entries. Only the soft, reassuring click of a lamp being switched off, and Nathaniel's gentle voice now a cherished ritual from the doorway. "Good night, James. Sleep well, son." At his new supportive school, James encountered Tommy Ricks, a boy from his old neighborhood, who used to relentlessly tease him for his torn clothes, his silence, and his worn-out shoes. At first, Tommy, now aware of James's changed circumstances, and the vague sensationalized news reports, avoided him, his face a mixture of shame and fear. But after a school counselor working with Nathaniel facilitated a carefully managed reconciliation meeting where Tommy heard a sanitized but impactful version of James's story, he approached James with visible hesitation, his eyes downcast. I'm so sorry, James," he stammered. "I didn't know. I had no idea. If I had, I wouldn't have. I was just being stupid." James was silent for a long moment, then said quietly, his voice devoid of malice, "I'm not mad, Tommy. Just don't ever do that to anyone else. You never know what they're going through." From that day forward, Tommy, humbled and transformed, became one of James's most loyal and fiercely protective friends. During a citywide student public speaking competition a year later, James, encouraged by Nathaniel and supported by Tommy, presented a speech. He titled it simply, "The Boy from the Coop." The audience, including the initially skeptical judging panel, was visibly profoundly moved, not just by the harrowing narrative of his past, but by his delivery. Calm, articulate, devoid of bitterness or anger, imbued only with a quiet strength and a message of resilience and hope. He didn't win the competition, but he won something far more valuable: the courage to tell his story on his own terms. At the same public library, where James once sought refuge and hid his precious journal, a small, intimate ceremony was held by a local child advocacy group honoring students who had demonstrated extraordinary courage in overcoming adversity. James was invited to say a few words. Standing at the microphone, he took a deep, steadying breath and looked out at the familiar faces in the audience: Nathaniel, Matilda, Detective Morton, Pastor Harold, even Mrs. Holloway and Sarah Evans, the social worker who'd first flagged his case. "I used to live in a chicken coop," he began, his voice clear and strong. "Now I have a light that always stays on a warm bed and someone who calls me son. The words I scratched on that wall, don't stay silent. They weren't just for others. They were for me too. Thank you for helping me find my voice." The entire room rose in a sustained, heartfelt standing ovation. Matilda, the stoic librarian, openly wiped away tears. Detective Charles Morton, now a close family friend to both father and son, stood quietly in the back, a proud, gratified smile on his face. That night, James returned to his small, peaceful blue room. He turned on his nightlight, its gentle glow painting the space with the warmth and peace he had once only dared to dream of. He climbed into bed, pulled up the cozy blanket, and glanced at the doorway, where Nathaniel stood watching him with an expression of profound love. "Dad," James said, his voice soft but sure, "we really have a home now." Nathaniel nodded, his eyes glistening, but his smile wide and unwavering. "Yes, son, we do. And you'll never ever have to leave it again." James closed his eyes. For the first time in his entire life, free from fear, surrounded by love, he slept soundly, deeply, and dreamlessly. Seasons turned blurring into years. The ancient tree in the park still stood, its gnarled branches reaching towards the sky. But beneath its canopy, there was no longer a small, frightened boy curled in fear, only the steady, comforting presence of a young man who had learned not just how to stand, but how to soar. 15 years later, crisp morning light spilled over the rows of utilitarian red brick buildings where the city's elite child protection unit was headquartered. A polished but unremarkable sedan pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and a tall, lean man, in a neatly tailored but practical suit, stepped out, his stride purposeful and steady, his shoulders squared with a quiet authority. The nameplate on his chest, simple and direct, read Detective James Whitman, CPU. With a sharp, analytical mind, an unwavering commitment to justice, and an empathy born of lived experience, James had become a living, breathing symbol of resilience and hope. At his side, adjusting his tie, walked his trusted partner, Detective Tommy Ricks. The boy who once mindlessly teased a vulnerable classmate was now his most steadfast ally, his right hand. In every challenging investigation, their bond forged in shared purpose and mutual respect. That morning, they entered a local children's shelter, their faces somber. A priority call had come in. A 9-year-old girl recently removed from her home, suspected of severe neglect and emotional abuse. James didn't just do his job. He lived it, breathed it, felt it in his very bones. Heart first, always. In a small, sterile interview room, a young girl, Lily, sat huddled in the corner of a worn armchair, her knees drawn to her chest. Faint, faded bruises shaped like fingerprints marked her tiny wrist. Her eyes lost vacant and wide, with a terror that was heartbreakingly familiar. Looked just like James's own at all those desolate years ago. James sat down quietly on a chair, a respectful distance away, not directly opposite her, but slightly to the side. He offered his hand palm up, a gesture of peace, not demand. "Hi, Lily," he said softly, his voice calm and gentle. "My name is James. I'm here to listen. You don't have to say anything at all if you're not ready. Just know that you're not alone anymore, and whatever you're feeling is okay." The girl looked at him, her lips pressed into a thin, tight line, her small body trembling. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. James reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a blank, pocket-sized notebook and a pen. "Sometimes," he said, placing them on the small table between them, "it's easier to write things down or draw them when the words are too hard to say. You don't have to hold it all in anymore, Lily. We're here to help you carry it." She looked at the notebook, then back at James, a flicker of something, curiosity, hope, in her desolate eyes. Her small hand, still shaking, reached out and took the pen. The first hesitant words began to appear on the blank page. Behind them, observing through the one-way glass, Tommy stood silent, deeply moved. He had once early in their partnership questioned why James, with his adoptive father's wealth and influence, had chosen this difficult, often heartbreaking path. Now he understood completely. James wasn't just a detective. He was a lifeline. He was the embodiment of hope for children teetering on the abyss. That day, after filing their comprehensive report and ensuring Lily was in a safe, specialized foster placement, James and Tommy didn't immediately return to the bustling precinct. Instead, James turned the car down a familiar tree-lined street, pulling into the quiet, almost deserted old park. The very place where he had once hidden from the relentless rain, once desperately buried a small wooden box beneath the ancient gnarled roots of an old tree, a silent testament to his suffering. By late afternoon, a soft melancholic breeze rustled the leaves overhead, now tinged with the gold and crimson of early autumn. James stepped beneath the familiar branches of the old tree. He placed a small, simple bouquet of wildflowers and a recent photograph. James, in his detective's uniform, beaming with Lily, smiling shyly beside him, holding a drawing. At the base of the tree, near a small, unobtrusive bronze plaque that had been installed years ago. It simply read, "For the boy who waited and for all who listen." Then he sat on the nearby worn wooden bench, his gaze fixed on the amber-hued sky. "Nathaniel." He murmured a quiet conversation with a cherished memory. "You found that box I buried. You showed me not everyone stays silent. Now I try to be that person for other kids, like you were for me." Behind him, Tommy arrived, having given him his moment alone. He said nothing, simply placed a supportive hand on James's shoulder. They sat together in companionable silence, as they had often done, two lives, one shared purpose, one enduring bond. In a widely circulated televised interview some years prior, part of a campaign to raise awareness for child abuse prevention, a well-meaning host had asked James, "Detective Whitman, given your adoptive father's considerable success and resources, many wonder why you chose the demanding, often traumatic career of a child protection officer rather than pursuing a path in business or finance." James had paused, his thoughtful gaze unwavering as he looked straight into the camera. "Because," he answered, his voice clear and resonant, "I know what it feels like to be trapped in darkness, for your cries to go unheard. But I also know what it feels like when someone finally listens. My dad, Nathaniel Grayson, a librarian, Matilda, a pastor, Harold, a neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, a detective, Charles Morton. They didn't just rescue me. They showed me what compassion in action looks like. I want to be that lifeline for someone else." James never hid his past. He honored it, transformed it into a beacon. At a university panel on child welfare reform, James opened his laptop and projected an old grainy image onto the large screen behind him. A stark, chilling close-up of a rotting wooden wall with crudely carved words illuminated by a flashlight's harsh glare. "If you find this, please don't stay silent." He turned to the captivated audience of aspiring social workers, lawyers, and educators. "You might be the first person, perhaps the only person, to hear a child's desperate cry. You can't save the whole world. But if each of us saves just one, the world changes." The room erupted in sustained emotional applause. In a quiet corner, Nathaniel, his hair now completely silver, his gait slower, but his eyes bright with unshed tears, watched his son with quiet, immense pride. Beside him, Charles Morton, now a retired but still active consultant, leaned over and whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "That boy, Nathaniel. He became the very light he once so desperately searched for." As James stepped down from the stage, he was surrounded by young attendees eager to shake his hand. One young man, his eyes shining, approached him, his voice choked. "Detective Whitman, your story. It saved me. That sentence from the Coop wall. I finally told someone." James paused, his expression softening, then gripped the young man's hand firmly. Now you help others find their voice. Stand beside them. Listen. Don't look away. On James's detective's badge beneath his name, there was a small, almost invisible inscription engraved by special request, "The one who hears silence." His life wasn't just a miracle, a testament to survival. It was living, breathing proof that even in the most desolate, lightless places, hope can be found. If only someone chooses to listen, chooses to act. On a crisp, clear autumn morning, the kind that made the heart ache with its beauty, the city awoke beneath the soft, gentle caress of sunlight, casting long golden hues over the red brick rooftops and the trees beginning to shed their vibrant leaves. Across a quiet, unassuming street, the large wall clock inside the bustling Central Region Office of Child Protection struck 7:00 a.m. Senior Inspector James Whitman, his title reflecting years of dedicated, impactful service, sat in the pre-briefing quiet of the main meeting room, his desk already neatly stacked with prioritized, unopened case files. Next to him, a steaming mug of strong black coffee, and his understated nameplate, Senior Detective James Whitman, Division of Youth Protection, Central Region. He opened a new file, his touch gentle despite the grim nature of its contents. A 9-year-old boy, Elian Navarro. Chronically absent from school, significantly malnourished, his eyes described in the intake report as hollow, as if something vital inside him had already died. The boy didn't speak, didn't cry, didn't offer any explanation when brought to the social care center by a worried teacher. But James understood with a chilling bone-deep resonance. Because once a lifetime ago, he had been Elian. And that was why, without a moment's hesitation, he took the case personally. After the morning briefing, James stepped out of the building into the crisp, invigorating fall air. A playful breeze stirred the colorful leaves in the trees lining the street, bringing with it the nostalgic scent of damp earth and old bittersweet memories. He drove to the temporary shelter where Elian was staying. Inside a pale, institutional blue room, Elian sat curled tightly in a hard plastic chair, staring out the barred window with an empty, vacant gaze. James entered quietly and sat down beside him, not directly facing him, allowing the boy his space. He didn't force eye contact, didn't begin with a barrage of questions. "Hi, Elian," he said quietly, his voice calm and soothing. "My name is James. A long time ago, I didn't talk much either. It felt safer. The first person who just sat next to me without asking anything, that helped. So if you don't want to say anything today or tomorrow, that's okay. We can just sit here. You're not alone." Elian flinched, then slowly, cautiously turned his head, his eyes widening in surprise. 1 second passed, then 2. Then his eyes, just for a fleeting instant, softened almost imperceptibly. It wasn't trust yet, not even true acceptance. But it was a beginning. A tiny, fragile thread of potential healing spun in shared understanding silence. In the weeks that followed, James began taking Elian on quiet afternoon walks through the same city park where he had once sought refuge. They walked slowly with no particular destination, no pressure to talk. James spoke occasionally in a low, gentle voice about the trees changing color, about a resilient baby bird he'd seen that had lost its mother, but still somehow learned how to fly. And sometimes he'd talk about a boy also named James, who once lived in a terrifying dark place, but who against all odds eventually found a safe, warm home. As the days then weeks passed, Elian began to ask small, tentative questions. "Were you scared? Why didn't you run?" James answered them all honestly, truthfully, because he believed children don't need comforting lies. They need truth shared with compassion and someone strong enough to walk them through it. 1 year later, Elian Navarro no longer silent, no longer hollow-eyed, stood as the chosen student speaker at the city's public school district opening ceremony. Wearing a crisp white shirt and a slightly too large tie that James had helped him knot, he held the microphone with both hands, his knuckles white but his stance firm. Hundreds of students, teachers, parents, and city officials watched in respectful silence. I used to think, Elian began, his voice clear and surprisingly steady, that no one heard me, that if I disappeared, no one would even notice. But then someone sat next to me when I couldn't speak. They didn't ask questions. They just stayed. Because of that one person, I'm still here. He paused, taking a shaky breath, then looked down at the front row where James Whitman was seated, a proud, unobtrusive presence. A small, genuine smile crossed Elian's face. I learned that sometimes what we need most isn't a hero, but someone who won't leave when we feel most alone. The crowd rose in a spontaneous, heartfelt standing ovation, and the room filled with a palpable warmth. James sat still, his expression serene, aware that the compassion he'd received, and now extended, had become someone else's guiding light. And now that light was being passed from hand to healing hand. On International Children's Day, several years later, the city honored several citizens for their outstanding long-term contributions to child protection and welfare. James, now a highly respected captain within the CPU, was called to the stage. He gave no long, eloquent speech. Just one powerful sentence, a principle etched in his being. I was once a child, no one called by name. Now I call out the names of other children to help them find their voices, to let them know they are seen. They are heard. They are valued. They are alive. Afterward, an eager young journalist approached James. Microphone extended. Captain Whitman, if you could go back to that day when you were that boy in the coop, what would you tell your younger self? James paused, his gaze momentarily distant, and then he looked directly into the camera, his eyes reflecting a profound, hard-won peace. I would tell him, hold on. The light is coming. And one day, incredibly, you'll stand in that light, and you'll use it to help show the way for someone else still lost in the darkness. Years continued their relentless healing march. Nathaniel Grayson, James's beloved adoptive father, grew old, his vibrant hair turning to soft silver, his once confident stride slowing. But his eyes, whenever they rested on James, still shone with an undiminished, fierce pride. At a prestigious university ceremony where James, already a recognized expert, was awarded an honorary doctorate in children's rights law, Nathaniel sat in the front row, his now trembling hands clapping with unflagging enthusiasm. James's doctoral thesis, Building a Proactive Child Protection Ecosystem, was lauded by academics as groundbreaking. In his acceptance speech, James spoke eloquently of gratitude. I thank the extraordinary man. He said, his voice thick with emotion as he looked at Nathaniel, who on a dark night pulled over for a small wet boy clutching a book. I thank the librarian who kept my truth safe. I thank the pastor who believed a child's desperate speech. Above all, I thank my father, Nathaniel Grayson, who simply quietly stayed beside me. Sometimes saving someone doesn't require grand gestures. It just takes staying, being present, believing. The packed auditorium rose in a thunderous, prolonged standing ovation. Nathaniel, tears streaming openly down his weathered cheeks, could only nod, his heart overflowing. He knew his greatest legacy wasn't his fortune. It was James. More years passed. A small, unpretentious statue was eventually erected in the old, now beautifully renovated park beneath the benevolent branches of the very tree where James had once sought solace. It depicted simply a young boy sitting at the tree's base, holding an open book, his face turned upwards towards hope. At its base, a single sentence. If you find this, please don't stay silent. Hundreds attended the unveiling. Children, parents, teachers, social workers, police officers. They came for James. For his quiet, unassuming presence, a man who felt like a friend. Someone who had, in the deepest sense, been there. A small child holding her grandmother's hand asked, "Who is that boy, Grandma?" An elderly woman, her eyes bright, Matilda, now well into her 80s, smiled gently. "That, my dear," she said, "represents someone who truly listened. And it honors all who choose to listen still." James's story became required reading in law schools and social work programs. A new public charter school opened in one of the city's poorest districts, the Whitman Grayson Institute for Resilience and Hope. Children there now had books, bright classrooms, and most importantly, their names affirmed and cherished. On a quiet, cool evening, James stood on the familiar balcony of the penthouse. Nathaniel had passed peacefully 3 years earlier, but his spirit lived on. The wind whispered through the city's trees. James opened an old, fragile notebook, the one from the chicken coop. The pages had yellowed, the childish, cramped handwriting making the grown man's eyes mist. At the bottom of the last tear-stained page, he now added one final line, his own handwriting firm and mature. "Thank you, Nathaniel. Thank you, Matilda. Thank you, world, for not staying silent." It made all the difference. He closed the notebook reverently. On his desk, an open letter lay waiting. From a young boy named Kai, aged 11, from a city hundreds of miles away. "Dear Captain Whitman," it read. "I saw you on TV. My dad, he used to hit me too. But after hearing you speak your story, I finally told my teacher. Now I'm somewhere safe. Thank you. I hope I can grow up brave like you." James picked up the letter, a slow, warm smile spreading across his face. His eyes, filled with a gentle, profound understanding, turned towards the vast night sky, brilliantly lit by thousands upon thousands of tiny city lights, each one a potential beacon. "Thank you, Nathaniel," he thought, his heart full. "Thank you to that terrified child I once was, who somehow didn't give up hope." The distant lights of the sprawling metropolis seemed to hum a familiar resonant chorus, a message carried on the night air. "If you find this, please don't stay silent." And now, thousands, perhaps millions, had heard it. They were speaking. They were listening. They were acting. And in their own ways, with their own voices, they were writing the next chapter in their own names. Thank you, wherever you are, for listening to James's journey from darkness into resilient, illuminating light. Maybe you were once hurt, your voice silenced. Maybe you are walking through profound uncertainty right now. Or maybe you simply paused and chose to truly listen to the story of a child once forgotten who found his voice. Whoever you are, thank you for not staying silent. If this story stirred something within, you don't let it fade. Be a small, steady light, a kind word, an outstretched hand, a genuine question, "Are you okay?" Or simply the profound gift of your willingness to sit beside someone in their silence and just stay. Because if you hear this, if you feel this, please don't stay silent. And thank you, not just for hearing a story, but for choosing in whatever way you can to carry a piece of our shared humanity forward.